Are you interested in the changing governmental roles in urban transformations? Our summary today works with the article titled Rethinking the Governance of Urban Infrastructural Transformations, a synthesis of emerging approaches, from 2022 by Jochen Monstadt, Jonas Colen Ladeia Torrens, Mansi Jain, M Macrorie, and Shaun R Smith, published in the Environmental Sustainability Journal. This is a great preparation to our next interview with Eric A. Bruman in episode 294, talking about a new form of governance from their experiments. Since we're investigating the future of cities, I thought it would be interesting to see how governance changes in our ever-changing world, answering current and future challenges. This article synthesizes emerging approaches to the governance of transformative infrastructural change, revealing their underlying logics and potential contributions.
What is the future for cities? Do you want to learn more about them? Do you want to know how others think about them? Do you want to be part of the conversation? Then this is the right place.
Welcome to today's What is the Future for Cities podcast and its research episode. My name is Fanny, and today I will introduce a research paper by summarizing it. The episode really is just a short summary of the original paper, and in case it is interesting enough, I would encourage everyone to check out the whole paper. This is also an experiment, as I produced and generated the summary part with Notebook LM as two hosts dissecting the whole report.
We're ready to really get into this research on urban infrastructure, and you've given me a lot to work with here, but what would you say is the big takeaway from all this?
At the heart of it, it's about seeing infrastructure as more than just keeping the lights on and the water running. It's really about shaping the future of cities, and all these sources we're looking at, they give us a whole new way to think about governing these really big changes.
Okay, so we're talking energy grids and transportation networks, even communication systems, right? The stuff that makes a city work.
Exactly. Those are the building blocks, and this research is about how we can shift those systems toward a more sustainable and equitable future.
And I keep seeing this phrase, infrastructural turn. Is that what we're talking about here? Like a new way of thinking?
Yeah, it really is. It's like we're finally waking up to the fact that infrastructure isn't just background noise. It shapes almost every aspect of city life, and it's got this power to either lock us into old patterns or help us move towards something better.
So it's like how I always order the same thing at my favorite restaurant. I'm stuck in my ways. But you're saying cities can get stuck in their ways too.
Think of it this way. You have a city built around cars, right? Wide roads, limited public transit, everything's spread out. It's really difficult to change that overnight, isn't it?
Wow.
That's what we call path dependency. Past decisions influencing the present.
Okay, that makes sense. So how do we break free from those old patterns? The research talked about 4 tools for transforming urban infrastructure.
And those tools, that can be really powerful, especially when you use them together. The first one is called futuring, which honestly sounds sci-fi to me.
I know, right? Are we going to be flying around those jetpacks we were promised? What does futuring actually mean?
It's all about envisioning different paths for our cities. Instead of just accepting the limitations we see today, we ask, what if? What if we could have a city where everyone can walk to a park in 15 minutes? What if our energy came entirely from renewable sources? It's about using tools like scenario planning to paint a picture of that future we want and then figuring out how to actually get there.
So it's not just wishful thinking, it's about making those dreams a reality.
Exactly. And there's this really interesting example from Northwest Europe. They had this project where they used a multimedia exhibit to help people really visualize a future powered by wind energy. And it actually helped break a political deadlock on wind power and led to some major policy changes.
Wow. Futuring can actually make a difference in those tough decisions. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
What's the next tool?
The next one is called experimentation, and this is where things get fun. Think of urban living labs or pilot programs, testing new tech in the real world, and then we learn from those experiments and figure out what works best.
This sounds fun. But wouldn't that just lead to a bunch of small-scale projects? How do you go from those little experiments to citywide change?
That's a great question. And while some experiments start small, the goal is to scale up the ones that are successful. Take Amsterdam, for example. They did this experiment to connect their energy and water systems.
Wait, connecting energy and water. How does that work?
If you think about it, treating and pumping water takes a lot of energy, and generating energy often needs water. By figuring out how to make those two systems work together, Amsterdam found a way to increase efficiency and reduce their environmental impact. And it all started with this small experiment that changed how they managed their infrastructure.
That's a pretty cool example. It shows that a seemingly small change can ripple through a whole system.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the third tool, cross-domain coordination.
And from what I'm reading here, this sounds like a big challenge. It's about getting all those different city departments to actually work together, right?
Think about it for a second. We have energy, water, transportation, waste management, all these systems that are interconnected, but they're often managed in silos. Cross-domain coordination is about breaking down those walls and getting everyone on the same page.
Easier said than done, I'm sure. But I can see how it would be so powerful if the transportation department actually talked to the folks in charge of parks and green spaces.
Absolutely. The research even mentions something called nexus thinking, where water, energy, and food systems are all addressed together. Imagine what we could do.
Okay, that's a big idea.
Yeah.
It's like going from looking at individual trees to seeing the whole forest.
Exactly. And that leads us to our final tool for today, assessment. It's all about measuring how well those changes are actually working.
Okay, so time to pull out the spreadsheets and graphs.
It's more than just the numbers. The research emphasizes this idea of formative evaluation, which basically means that assessment should be an ongoing process, and it should include everyone who's affected by these changes.
So not just the experts, but also the people living in the city.
Exactly. We need to ask, are these changes really benefiting the people they're supposed to? Assessment helps us course correct along the way and make sure we're moving in the right direction.
Okay, my brain is definitely doing some reimagining here. These 4 tools are like a whole new way to think about cities. But before we get too carried away with all this change, you mentioned path dependency earlier about cities getting stuck in those old patterns.
It really is like trying to turn a giant ship around. It takes a lot of time and effort. Cities have this kind of inertia. They're built on these massive networks of pipes and cables and roads, all that stuff that's not easy to just rip out and replace.
So we're not just talking about bad habits. It's like the city itself is resisting change.
Think about it. Those systems represent huge investments, financial and political. A city might have spent millions on a highway system 50 years ago, and even if everyone knows it's causing traffic and pollution, it's really hard to just tear it down and start over.
Okay, I see how this all connects. We're talking about changing patterns that are baked in. It's like trying to get my family to try a new restaurant. It's not going to happen.
Exactly. But that's why these new approaches are so important. They give us a way to break free from those old patterns and create cities that can adapt to the challenges we face today.
Speaking of challenges, one thing that really stands out in this research is the focus on social equity. How do these infrastructure changes affect different communities?
That's such a crucial question. Infrastructure isn't just about making things efficient or functional. It's about making sure that everyone has what they need to thrive.
But hasn't infrastructure often made inequality worse? Historically speaking, I'm thinking about those highways that cut right through low-income neighborhoods, dividing communities and displacing people.
That's a perfect example of what we don't want to repeat. And these new approaches, they give us a way to do things differently. If we're talking about a new public transit line, for example, we need to think about who it will serve, what neighborhoods it connects, and if everyone can afford to ride it.
So it's not just about shiny new trains. It's about making sure those trains actually make people's lives better, especially in communities that have been overlooked in the past.
Exactly. It's about using infrastructure to create a more just and equitable city for everyone. The research really pushes back against this idea of one-size-fits-all solutions.
So you're saying what works in one city might not work in another?
Precisely. Cities are so diverse geographically, culturally, economically. So what makes sense in Tokyo might not be the best approach for a city like Mumbai.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like that saying, think globally, act locally. We need to really understand each city before we start making these big changes.
And that means involving the people who live there. They know their own neighborhoods best, and their knowledge and experiences are invaluable.
This sounds amazing in theory, but let's be real here. Change is hard. How do we actually put these ideas into practice? I can already see the pushback from politicians and developers and anyone who hates anything new.
You're not wrong. Transforming infrastructure is a long game. It takes building new relationships and institutions, even new ways of thinking.
So we need more than a good plan. We need to be able to actually make it happen.
The research calls this building governance capacity. It means developing the skills and resources to manage all this complexity: data analysis, stakeholder engagement, even conflict resolution.
Sounds like we need a whole new generation of urban planners to tackle these issues.
Oh.
But you mentioned collaboration. It's not just about the experts, right?
Absolutely. We need to get everyone involved. Government agencies, private companies, community groups, residents, everyone.
That's a lot of different voices.
It is. But when you create spaces for dialogue and collaboration, incredible things can happen. And that's what these transformative approaches are all about, working together to build better cities.
I like the sound of that. But
Yeah.
let's not sugarcoat things. What are some of the challenges we might face? There will always be people who resist change, right?
You're absolutely right. And one of the biggest challenges is overcoming those vested interests, the people who benefit from keeping things the way they are.
Like, I'm guessing the oil and gas industry won't be too excited about a city switching to renewable energy.
Exactly. We have to be prepared to challenge those interests and build coalitions that support a more sustainable future.
And even beyond those powerful groups, there's just the sheer complexity of urban systems. How do we know making one change won't have unintended consequences somewhere else down the line?
That's a risk we have to acknowledge. We're dealing with these interconnected systems, and you can't predict everything, but that's why these approaches emphasize flexibility. We need to be willing to learn and adapt as we go.
So it's like this ongoing experiment.
In a way, yes. We're always learning and evolving, but we also need to be careful about how these approaches are used.
What do you mean?
We have to watch out for greenwashing, where things sound good, but they don't actually do what they promise. And we need to be wary of techno-solutionism, this idea that technology alone can solve everything.
It's like thinking that just because I bought an electric car, I'm single-handedly saving the planet. It's about looking at the bigger picture.
Transforming infrastructure. It's about changing our behaviors and our systems.
Okay, so it's not just about how many miles of bike lanes we build or solar panels we install. What are some other ways to measure success?
We need to look at the long-term impacts, social, environmental, and in terms of equity. Are we reducing pollution? Are we creating more affordable housing? Are we improving people's health and being?
So we need to look beyond just the numbers.
It's about understanding how these changes are affecting people's lives. And this brings up another interesting point from the research, the role of knowledge and expertise. Who gets to decide what a successful transformation actually looks like?
That's a great question. The research seems to challenge those traditional top-down approaches where the experts have all the answers.
It's about recognizing that local communities, indigenous groups, and marginalized voices, they all have valuable knowledge and perspectives that are often missing from those traditional planning processes.
It's if you want to know how to make a city more walkable, maybe you should talk to the people who actually walk everywhere.
Exactly. It's about a more inclusive approach to knowledge.
So we're just talking about technical expertise. We're talking about lived experience, cultural knowledge, even traditional ecological knowledge.
It's about acknowledging all those different ways of knowing that can contribute to a richer understanding of a city and what it needs.
This has been a really fascinating look at urban infrastructure. I'm feeling inspired, but also a bit overwhelmed by how big this challenge is. What can we as individuals do to be part of this transformation?
That's a great question and one we should definitely explore. But first, there's one more idea from the research I think you'll find interesting. It's called urban obduracy, and it might be the biggest hurdle of all.
Okay, urban obduracy. That sounds scary. What exactly does it mean?
It's basically the city's resistance to change, a built-in immune system that tries to fight off anything new or different.
So it's like when I try to get my family to play a new board game, they just want to stick with the same old one we've always played.
And in a city, that resistance can come from a lot of places. Powerful people who like things the way they are, bureaucracy, cultural norms that are hard to shift, even just a general fear of change.
It sounds like a pretty deep resistance. So how do we actually overcome that and make real change happen?
There's no easy answer. It takes a lot of different approaches. But first, we have to make a really strong case for change.
You mean showing people why the current system isn't working?
Yeah. We have to explain the problems with the way things are and then paint a clear picture of what a better future could look like. And we need to back that up with real evidence, data research examples that people can connect with.
So if I want to convince my family to play that new board game, I can't just say, trust me, it's fun. I got to show them reviews, maybe tell them about a time I played it with friends and had a blast.
Exactly. And just like with your board game, it's not enough to just convince one person. You need to build a whole group of people who support the change.
So in a city, that would be like getting residents on board and community groups, businesses, and of course, the people in charge.
Exactly. Big changes rarely happen when just one person wants them. It takes bringing a bunch of different people together who all share the same vision for the future.
But even with a good plan and lots of support, wouldn't we still hit some roadblocks? Like those bureaucratic systems you talked about? They seem so hard to change.
Oh, absolutely. You're right. And that's why we have to be smart about it. We need to find those pressure points in the system where we can make the biggest difference with what we have.
So it's like playing chess. You got to think a few moves ahead.
Exactly. You might need to focus on changing certain rules or building relationships with the people who have the power to make those changes happen.
This is starting to sound really complicated.
It is. And it brings us to another really important thing: patience. Transforming infrastructure. It's a marathon, not a sprint. There will be setbacks and delays and times when it feels like nothing is happening.
So we have to be ready for the long haul.
We do. We need to celebrate those small wins, learn from our mistakes, and keep going even when it gets tough. And maybe the most important thing is to believe that change is actually possible.
That's a good point. It's easy to get discouraged when you're up against a system that seems impossible to change.
It is, but cities are always changing, and people are incredibly creative and adaptable. If we can use that energy and focus it towards a positive vision, we can create amazing cities.
This whole conversation has really changed how I look at my own city. I'm noticing the infrastructure everywhere, the good, the bad, and all the potential for something better.
That's a great place to start. Pay attention, ask questions, get involved in your community. Even small actions can contribute to a bigger transformation. Remember, transforming infrastructure, it's not just about technology. It's about people and how we work together to build a better future.
What is the Future for Cities podcast?